Welcome to our comprehensive timeline of the Vietnam War. In this video, we'll take you through the key events that shaped this pivotal conflict in history. This is not just a recounting of dates and battles, but an exploration of the human cost of war and the enduring power of resilience. Before the first shot was fired, the seeds of the Vietnam War were sown in the fertile ground of colonialism and the yearning for independence. Vietnam had endured the yoke of foreign rule occupied by the French since the mid-1800s. The spirit of the Vietnamese people, embodied in Ho Chi Minh, could not be extinguished. The Communist North, led by Ho Chi Minh, sought to unify the country, while the South, supported by the United States, fought to stem the tide of communism. The First Indochina War, from 1946 to 1954, was a prelude to the larger war to come. The French forces, weary from World War II, faced the determined Viet Minh. The pivotal moment came in 1954 at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. The Viet Minh, led by General Giap, laid siege to the French stronghold. The fall of Dien Bien Phu marked the end of French colonialism in Vietnam. The Geneva Accords of 1954 temporarily partitioned Vietnam, setting the stage for the next chapter in Vietnam's struggle. In the early 1960s, the United States, driven by the domino theory, increased its military presence in South Vietnam. Advisors, training and supplies flowed into the South. In August 1964, an incident in the Gulf of Tonkin became a pivotal turning point. The USS Maddox reported being attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution granted President Lyndon B. Johnson broad authority to conduct military operations in Vietnam. With this resolution, America was fully committed to the conflict in Southeast Asia. Chapter 4: The Tet Offensive, A Nation Divided. As the war dragged on, American public opinion began to sour. In January 1968, the North Vietnamese launched a surprise offensive during Tet. The Tet Offensive exposed the vulnerability of the American position. Though the offensive was repelled, it came at a heavy cost for both sides. The ferocity of the fighting and the stark images broadcast into American homes eroded public support for the war. The war became a source of deep division and national soul-searching. Chapter 5: My Lai, The Darkness Within. On March 16, 1968, American soldiers entered the village of My Lai. Convinced the village harbored Viet Cong, they embarked on a rampage of unimaginable brutality. The My Lai massacre, kept hidden from the public for over a year, sparked outrage when revealed. It became a symbol of the moral depravity of war and fueled the anti-war movement. The massacre raised troubling questions about the conduct of the war and the psychological toll on soldiers. Chapter 6: The Paris Peace Accords, A Glimmer of Hope. By the early 1970s, the United States sought a negotiated settlement. The war had dragged on for years, causing immense loss of life and resources. The American public was growing increasingly weary of the conflict, and pressure mounted on the government to find a way out. Peace talks in Paris, which began in 1968, dragged on for years. The negotiations were complex and fraught with challenges, as both sides had deeply entrenched positions. Despite numerous setbacks, the talks continued, driven by a glimmer of hope for peace. On January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, ending direct U.S. military involvement. This historic agreement marked a significant turning point, as it aimed to bring an end to years of bloodshed and turmoil. The accords called for a ceasefire and the withdrawal of all U.S. troops. American soldiers began to pack up and leave, marking the end of their long and arduous involvement in Vietnam. The withdrawal was a moment of relief for many, signaling a potential end to the conflict. For many Americans, it represented a long-awaited end to a costly war. Celebrations erupted across the country as people rejoiced in the hope that peace had finally been achieved. The sense of relief was palpable, as families looked forward to welcoming their loved ones home. But for the Vietnamese, the war was far from over. The country remained deeply divided, and the scars of conflict were evident everywhere. The peace accords, while a step forward, did not address the underlying issues that had fueled the war for so long. The fragile peace would prove to be short-lived as the North Vietnamese prepared for a final offensive. The hope for lasting peace was overshadowed by the looming threat of renewed conflict, leaving the future of Vietnam uncertain and precarious. Chapter 7. The Fall of Saigon, the war's bitter end. In the spring of 1975, the North Vietnamese army launched a massive offensive. This was a well-coordinated and relentless push that aimed to bring the war to a decisive end. The offensive was marked by intense battles and strategic maneuvers that overwhelmed the South Vietnamese forces. The South Vietnamese army crumbled under the onslaught. Despite their efforts to hold their ground, they were outmatched and outnumbered. The rapid advance of the North Vietnamese forces led to a chaotic retreat, with soldiers and civilians alike fleeing in desperation. As the North Vietnamese closed in on Saigon, panic and chaos ensued. The streets were filled with people trying to escape, and the atmosphere was one of fear and uncertainty. The city, once bustling with life, was now a scene of utter turmoil. On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. This moment symbolized the complete takeover of the city and the ultimate victory of the North Vietnamese forces. It was a historic and dramatic end to a long and brutal conflict. The fall of Saigon marked the end of the Vietnam War. It was a moment that signified not just the end of a war, but the beginning of a new chapter for Vietnam. The country would now face the challenges of rebuilding and healing from the scars of conflict. The images of that day became enduring symbols of the war's chaotic and tragic end. Helicopters evacuating people from the US Embassy, desperate crowds at the gates, and the haunting scenes of departure are etched into the collective memory of those who witnessed it. It marked the end of the Cold War's most significant proxy conflict and a blow to American prestige. The Vietnam War had far-reaching implications, affecting not only the people of Vietnam but also shaping international relations and military strategies for years to come. The lessons learned from this conflict continue to resonate in the corridors of power and in the hearts of those who lived through it. Chapter 8. Scars of War. Major battles and combat events of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was marked by numerous significant battles and combat events that shaped the course of the conflict. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954 was a pivotal moment, leading to the end of French colonial rule in Vietnam. Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign by the United States, aimed to weaken North Vietnam's resolve, but ultimately escalated the war. The Tet Offensive in 1968 was a turning point as North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched coordinated attacks across South Vietnam. The Battle of Hue, one of the bloodiest battles of the war, saw intense urban combat and significant casualties. Meanwhile, the siege of Khe Sanh Combat Base tested the endurance and resilience of American and South Vietnamese forces. The My Lai massacre in 1968 shocked the world, revealing the brutal realities of the war and sparking outrage. The Battle of Hamburger Hill in 1969 was another fierce encounter, with heavy losses on both sides. In 1972, Operation Linebacker II, also known as the Christmas bombing, was a massive aerial bombardment campaign that pressured North Vietnam into peace negotiations. The fall of Saigon in 1975 marked the end of the Vietnam War, as North Vietnamese forces captured the capital of South Vietnam. The dramatic evacuation of the American embassy and the iconic images of North Vietnamese tanks entering Saigon symbolized the conclusion of a long and devastating conflict. The aftermath of these battles left deep scars on both the land and the people. War memorials and veterans' reflections on combat serve as poignant reminders of the sacrifices made. The major battles and combat events of the Vietnam War continued to be studied and remembered, highlighting the complexities and human cost of warfare. The legacy of these battles extends beyond Vietnam, influencing international relations and military strategies. They serve as a cautionary tale about the human cost of conflict and the importance of diplomacy and understanding. The lessons learned from the Vietnam War's major battles urge us to strive for a more peaceful world. Chapter 9. Legacies, the Vietnam War's enduring impact. The Vietnam War saw significant combat operations that have left a lasting impact. Key battles like the Tet Offensive and the Battle of Khe Sanh were pivotal moments. These operations led to a reassessment of military strategies and tactics. The use of aerial bombings and napalm strikes highlighted the intensity of the conflict. It serves as a cautionary tale about the limits of American power and the importance of public support for military interventions. Chapter 10. Reflections Remembering Vietnam. The Vietnam War was marked by numerous key battles, each with its own story of heroism and tragedy. Battles like Khe Sanh and the Tet Offensive were pivotal moments that tested the resolve of soldiers on both sides. The experiences of soldiers were harrowing, filled with moments of intense combat, personal loss, and the struggle to survive in a hostile environment. Let us remember the bravery and sacrifices of those who fought, and the lessons learned from their experiences. Outro: Remembering Vietnam, a call for peace. Thank you for watching our timeline of the Vietnam War. We've